I am kind of at the confluence of online privacy and security as well as human-computer interaction. So broadly speaking, I'm interested in how people make privacy and security decisions and then using that data to make better interfaces to help them make better security decisions in the future. So I was going to speak about 3 different projects that my group is currently working on. So the first is looking at framing of privacy and security decisions. And I was going to call out a couple experiments we've been doing in that area, and then move on to privacy and the Internet of Things, and then privacy on mobile devices. So both of those are very relevant right now. So, framing privacy and security decisions. So this project started several years ago, beginning with a new collaboration eager from NSF with Eyal Peer, who's a psychologist based in Israel. And the idea is that up until very recently, most security systems have not been designed with the user in mind. So, people are thrown these complicated security warnings with lots of jargon, and so it's, not really unexpected that most users make very poor decisions. Over the past decade, that started to change, but fundamentally, one of the main problems we have is that everyone's shown the same security information, regardless of who you are. But that's a lot different in other areas. So for instance, unless you have small children, you probably don't see commercials for children's breakfast cereal on TV. And that's because people in marketing have been exploiting, segmentation and targeting over the past century or so. So the goal of our project was to see whether we could target different security messaging at different types of people based on inferred traits to see if that would result in more optimal decision making. So one of the recent experiments that we did focused on passwords, so nudging users to create stronger passwords. And the only reason why we focused on passwords is over the past 5 or 10 years, there have been a lot of studies coming out of the usable security community that have looked at individual nudges to try and get people to create stronger passwords, but have not actually looked at how to target those to specific individuals. So we know that in the base case, there are several techniques that have all been shown to result in aggregate effects. So what we did was we selected a whole bunch of these and we gave them to people. In the control condition, we had them role play a task where they were creating a new password for a webmail account. We chose this task because there have been other studies recently that have shown that this type of role playing actually produces very similar passwords to what people would choose in real life. Some of the techniques, the nudges that we used, there were password meters. These are commonly deployed and actually are relatively effective. Other studies have looked at quantifying feedback, so specifically social feedback, so putting your password strength relative to other people. Turns out that has been shown to be somewhat effective. Giving people tips on how to strengthen the password has also been shown to be effective by itself. So, in this case, the advice is, insert some random characters in the middle of your password to make it stronger. Another is quantitative feedback, simply telling them how long it might take for someone to crack this password. So we randomly assigned people these conditions, and then also we had collected various psychometrics from them. We separated these 2 tasks by about a week so that there wasn't any priming, but we basically have psychometric profiles for all the people who had participated, and we chose scales relating to decision making, which we had previously discovered and shown that a lot of these decision making traits do correlate with privacy and security behaviors. So ultimately what we found was that these traits do predict susceptibility to some of the nudges. For instance, people with low numeracy created much weaker passwords when given quantitative feedback. So people who don't really know how to weigh numbers, the numbers didn't help them. That makes sense, right? Rational people and people who had high need for cognition, they responded pretty well to the quantitative feedback. And so, here's some examples of some of these interaction effects. This is using the Johnson-Neyman method, which is a bootstrapping method to look at nonlinear interaction effects. Basically, what we find is that there are these regions of significance. So if you just looked for, linear relationships, you're not going to find anything. So, here this is looking at people who have, high numeracy on this end of the scale. Only people who had high numeracy created stronger passwords when they were given the feedback that had to do with how long it took for someone to crack the password. Here's another example. This has a negative slope. So here people who had high consideration for future consequences. For those people, giving them the password meter didn't really make much of a difference. And that's because people who had high consideration for future consequences tended to be pretty good at creating stronger passwords, and therefore feedback really didn't make much difference for them. So we did this study, we looked at these correlations, we then formulated a model, and then we validated that. So we basically replicated the whole experiment using another, a completely new sample, and we assigned people to 3 different conditions. We had a control condition where there was just, the thing to change your password. We looked at the strength of those passwords. There was a randomly targeted nudge. We narrowed this down to just two different nudges, the password meter and the crack time. And then there was the optimally targeted nudge. So considering the psychometrics that we had already obtained on these participants, we then targeted the nudge that we expected to have the strongest effect on them. And sure enough, this works. So people in the who had the optimal nudge, that resulted in the largest behavior change. A random nudge, worked pretty well relative to the control, but not as well as the optimal condition. And what was interesting was when looking at some of these interaction effects, some of these nudges by themselves actually resulted in decreased password strength. So in this case, the crack time nudge, which was really only effective on people who had, either strong need for cognition or high numeracy, actually, those people on the whole population is a relatively small segment, and therefore giving that nudge to everyone actually results in weaker passwords. But if we target that nudge, to only the people who are most likely to benefit from it, we actually get a positive effect. So that's what we're doing with regard to nudges. Completely different thing, privacy and IoT. So this is based on this observation, and this kind of encompasses the mobile privacy stuff too, is that right now most systems, when they do regulate privacy, users are given choices framed around the type of data being captured and to whom it's being shared. So here's a screenshot from Android. It's a permission dialog asking for permission to share location data with Twitter. Well, what does that really mean? The problem is most people don't actually make privacy decisions that way because context is important. So the data is shared with Twitter, well, for what purpose? And so this is a collaboration with Helen Nissenbaum, who's a philosopher who's created this framework to think better, as a better way of thinking about privacy. And the idea is contextual integrity. So you can model privacy violations as the data flow, but a data flow subject to a specific context. So you have the data recipient, the data subject, but then how is that data actually going to be used? So, if we think about it this way, I might expect my medical data to be used by my doctor for treatment, but I don't expect that doctor to be using the medical data for marketing purposes. If we frame this around how, systems are currently asking users to make these decisions, is the doctor allowed to, to obtain medical data? Well, if you frame it that way, then, data would be collected for both of these purposes, and we know that that isn't really how people think about it. So the question is, how do we apply this model in practice? Inferring context is hard, and I think that's why most systems just ask about, the data recipient and the data type, because those are easy things you don't even have to infer them. Those are things that are given up front. Inferring how the data is going to be used is relatively difficult. But there are various proxies that you can use for trying to reason about how data might be used. So, the recipient, for instance, if it's going to, an advertising company, you could probably infer the data would be used for advertising purposes, and so forth. So one of the studies we've done this year was framed around smart TVs and data capture. So we did a large-scale survey asking smart TV owners about their expectations for data capture in several different scenarios, and these were all tied to real features as they exist on TVs today. Things like capturing, viewing history for the purposes of making recommendations, or, for instance, capturing photos of you to recognize gestures. And what we found is that there's a wide variety of assumptions in terms of what people believe is happening to this type of data and what they believe can, what they can do about it. So many people said that they're, very concerned about data being used for other purposes beyond, what the data was collected for. But at the same time, most of them said that they expect that this will happen regardless, which is kind of interesting in the sense of sort of learned helplessness with regard to online privacy. Many people also said that they believe that there are legal protections that prevent the data from being used for various objectionable uses. Those legal protections don't exist. This study was just cited recently in a lawsuit against Vizio, who was sued both by the FTC and then in a private class action for selling customers viewing data without consent, and so very relevant to this work. So we're looking at, now in-home IoT devices, specifically voice-activated devices like your, Google Home, the Amazon Echo, and we're interested in exploring what users expect to be recorded, under what circumstances, what they think will happen to that data, and whether any of this is already happening to them. And so as a first cut at this problem, one of the studies we're looking at is with regard to these existing devices, the Echo and the Google Home. Both of these devices actually allow users to go online and listen to audio clips that were previously recorded in their home. So what we're doing is we're creating a browser extension for the popular web browsers that will screen scrape the data from these sites, present the audio clips to users, and basically just ask them questions about the circumstances under which this was recorded so that we can understand, whether that was expected and so forth. Anyway, I'm going to skip over the rest and go to the last project since I'm running out of time. So last thing we're doing is looking at mobile devices. So my group has been doing a lot of work both on campus and now at ICSI over the past several years instrumenting Android to look at how data is flowing from apps to third parties. In parallel, people in Vern's group had developed this network monitoring tool for mobile devices called Haystack. Narceo Valina Rodriguez has been doing a lot of the work in that area. We started talking about how we could combine these tools to basically create an end-to-end test bed to look at how third-party apps on mobile platforms access data and with whom they send it. Specific things are, certain data types that are concerning to people, like location data, but also persistent identifiers, which are, that tend to be less understood by consumers in terms of the privacy implications. So these network flows are dynamically generated at runtime, but that creates a problem in that we need to actually run the apps to generate data. First solution, we hired a bunch of undergrads to play 500 apps. And then we compared that with the Exerciser Monkey. So the Exerciser Monkey is a tool that comes with the Android SDK that basically just generates random UI events, button presses and so forth. And we found that we get equivalent code coverage for games. For 60% of the games we looked at, we get about equivalent code coverage between the Monkey and the undergrads. And so the Monkey seems to be a good substitute for the undergrads. So we're running apps through our test bed. We're instrumenting all the Android APIs that have to do with protecting personal data, and then we're doing deep packet inspection. All this is on a website. If you go to appcensus.mobi, you can search for apps, see what data your favorite apps are collecting. We've done several studies. We're looking at legal violations. I guess I'll skip over this since I'm probably out of time. Specifically, we've been looking at children's apps and found that a majority seem to be violating federal law. We published this at Privacy Enhancing Technologies earlier this year, and that's resulted in several lawsuits now against app developers who are targeting games at kids. 3 weeks ago, there was an article on this in the New York Times. A state AG is using our data to pursue a bunch of developers. They even sent a photographer to ICSI, which was fun. They took a look at my office and said there are too many office plants and not enough blinking lights. So we went to the server room, which I had never been in before, and we did a whole photo shoot there. So to wrap up, we're developing a whole pipeline for dynamic analysis on apps. Most of this is already built. We're working on developing an API, which we're planning to commercialize, since there are a lot of companies that have been asking us for access to the data. And I'll leave it at that.